Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into the birth of a nation, really. Those first 11 years, 1789 to 1800.
Right.
Imagine this brand new government, fresh off the blueprint of the Constitution, suddenly having to figure out how to actually run things.
Mm-hmm.
This is where theory met reality, sparking huge debates, major conflicts, and really laying the groundwork for so much of America.
Yeah, it did.
Today, we're unpacking the sources you've shared, looking at the key moments, the big ideas, and maybe some unexpected challenges from that first decade.
That's exactly right.
Mhm.
It's far from a smooth takeoff. The Constitution gave the structure, but putting it into practice, that meant dealing with intense disagreements. Power, economics, the very identity of this new republic. We'll see how the institutions got built, how deep political divisions formed, and how policy decisions weren't just, administrative. They often became battle lines for fundamental clashes. These years really stress-tested the whole American experiment right from day one.
So where does this new government even begin? What was the absolute first priority after the Constitution's ratified and the elections are done?
Well, the immediate task was making the government tangible, turning the words on paper into actual working bodies, and crucially, earning the trust of people who just fought a revolution against, strong central authority.
Right, suspicion of power.
Exactly. They had to build the machinery and convince people it wasn't just another distant power to fear.
And part of earning that trust, or maybe dealing with those fears, involved the Bill of Rights. But I understand some people initially didn't think it was even necessary.
That's a critical point.
Yeah.
The Bill of Rights wasn't in the original draft from Philadelphia. It really came out of the ratification fights.
Okay.
The Anti-Federalists argued really strongly that without explicit protections, the new federal government would just, walk all over individual liberties. People like George Mason, Patrick Henry. Very vocal. Thomas Jefferson, writing from France, basically said, a Bill of Rights is something people are entitled to against every government on earth.
But the Federalists, the ones who pushed the Constitution, like Hamilton, even Madison at first, they were wary.
Exactly. Some, like James Wilson, said it was redundant. The government only had specific limited powers, so why list rights it supposedly couldn't violate?
Right, the enumerated powers argument.
And Hamilton, in Federalist 84, even worried it could be dangerous, like implying that any rights not listed weren't protected. But Madison, he shifted his view. He saw the strong opposition, the demands from state conventions. He realized it was politically necessary. He needed to extinguish the apprehensions, as he put it, of the Anti-Federalists and avoid maybe a whole second convention.
So Madison, despite maybe not loving the idea initially, becomes the guy pushing it through Congress. What were some of the key rights in those first 10 amendments ratified by 91?
Well, the core ones we know. Freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, the right to bear arms, protections against unreasonable searches, due process, fair trials, things like that.
But there was a catch.
There was. The sources show an early compromise, or maybe a limitation. Madison tried, but couldn't get them applied against state governments initially.
So states could still violate those rights?
Potentially, yes. That limitation really shows the early resistance to federal power overseeing states on civil liberties. It took the 14th Amendment much later to start changing that.
Okay, so rights are being debated. What about the actual court system? The Constitution mentions the Supreme Court, but leaves the rest kind of open.
Right, and that gap was filled by the Judiciary Act of 1789. This was actually the very first bill introduced in the Senate, signed into law by Washington.
And it created the structure we basically still have.
Pretty much. The three tiers. The Supreme Court, though smaller at first, just a Chief Justice and 5 associates. Then the circuit courts, those were the main trial courts for federal stuff, and famously, the justices had to ride circuit, travel around.
Right, physically travel to hear cases.
Yeah. And then the district courts, usually one per state, for smaller federal matters.
How did this act handle that fear of federal power, that suspicion we mentioned?
Well, it had compromises baked in. State courts kept concurrent jurisdiction, meaning they could hear many federal cases too. Federal courts often had to follow state jury rules, and cases usually had to be tried in the defendant's home district.
So some concessions to local control.
But, and this is key, the act also firmly asserted federal power. Section 25 was the really controversial part.
What did Section 25 do?
It gave the U.S. Supreme Court the authority to hear appeals from state Supreme Courts if the case involved federal law or the Constitution. Basically, federal judicial review over state decisions on federal questions.
So setting up the courts immediately sparked that federal versus state power debate.
Absolutely. Yes. In a tough compromise, it barely passed, and Section 25 especially got pushback from states' rights advocates. Showed that tension was there from day one.
All right, Bill of Rights, court system, but the economy. That seems like maybe the biggest, most immediate fire to put out.
Arguably, yes. The most pressing challenge. The country was drowning in debt from the revolution. About $77 million, including state debts. Huge number back then.
And that's where Alexander Hamilton comes in, as Treasury Secretary.
That's right. He had a bold, comprehensive plan to fix it, and really to build a strong national economy.
Okay, tell us about Hamilton's plan. Where did he start?
His first big proposal was in his report on public credit. Two main ideas: funding the national debt at par and federal assumption of state debts.
Funding at par, paying full face value.
Exactly. Paying the full value of those government bonds to whoever held them now, even if speculators bought them for, pennies on the dollar from soldiers or farmers who needed cash.
Ooh, I can see how that would be controversial.
Hugely. Hamilton argued it was vital to establish the government's credit. You had to show you'd pay your debts.
An assumption. Taking on the state debts.
Yes. The federal government taking responsibility for the roughly $25 million owed by the states. Hamilton wanted to consolidate financial power federally, but also, crucially, create a class of wealthy creditors, people holding these federal bonds who'd have a vested interest in the national government's success.
Make the rich invested in the country's survival.
You could put it that way. He famously called the national debt, properly managed, a national blessing.
This sounds like it must have faced opposition. Who pushed back?
Oh, big time. James Madison opposed funding at par without helping the original bondholders somehow. Assumption faced even tougher resistance, especially from southern states like Virginia.
Why them particularly?
They'd already paid off a lot of their own debt. They felt Assumption unfairly benefited northern states, which often had more debt, and it rewarded speculators. This whole debate really threw emerging regional and class divisions into sharp relief.
How did they break the deadlock on something so divisive?
Through the famous Compromise of 1790. Basically a backroom deal.
The dinner table bargain.
Sort of, yeah. Brokered with Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton agreed to use his influence to locate the permanent national capital on the Potomac River, a Southern priority. In exchange, Jefferson and Madison helped find Southern votes to pass the Assumption Bill.
So the location of Washington, D.C. is tied directly to this financial compromise.
Literally shaped the geography of federal power. It shows how politics and policy were intertwined from the start.
Okay, so debt funded, state debts assumed. What was the next piece of Hamilton's economic puzzle?
The creation of a national bank, the Bank of the United States. He proposed it shortly after the debt plan.
Modeled on the Bank of England.
Right. It would handle government money, issue currency, provide loans. Hamilton argued it was necessary and proper under the Constitution's implied powers.
Yeah.
Needed for the government to manage finances, collect taxes, regulate commerce.
And the opposition, I assume Jefferson and Madison weren't fans.
Led the charge against it. They argued for a strict construction. If the Constitution doesn't explicitly say Congress can create a bank, then it can't.
No implied powers for them.
Exactly. They feared it would concentrate too much power with northern elites, bankers, merchants, and hurt farmers. They saw it as potentially corrupting and unconstitutional.
But it passed anyway.
Congress passed it. Washington, after carefully considering written arguments from both Hamilton and Jefferson, sided with Hamilton and signed the bill. But that debate over the bank, it was huge. It really crystallized opposing views on the Constitution that would define the emerging parties.
Hamilton also had ideas about boosting American manufacturing, didn't he?
Yes, his report on manufacturers. He wanted the government to actively support domestic industries, things like tariffs on imports, subsidies, incentives.
To make the U.S. less reliant on Europe.
Precisely. Reduce dependence on foreign goods, create a more balanced economy. He argued it would diversify jobs, spur innovation, attract skilled immigrants, and create a home market for farmers' crops.
Did that part of his plan fly?
Not really. Not then. It faced strong opposition, again, especially from Jefferson and Southern agrarians. They worried tariffs would just raise prices for consumers and hurt agricultural exports if other countries retaliated. The most ambitious parts weren't adopted, but the report itself. It laid out the intellectual case for industrial policy for years to come.
And to fund all this, the Debt payments, maybe a bank, future plans. He needed money coming in. Where did the revenue come from?
Customs duties, tariffs on imports were the main source. But he also introduced excise taxes on some domestic goods.
Ah, and the most controversial was?
The tax on whiskey, passed in 1791. This hit Western farmers really hard.
Why them specifically?
Because turning grain into whiskey was often the only practical way for them to get their crops to market over bad roads. Whiskey was easier to transport, lasted longer, and was even used like currency on the frontier. They felt this tax was unfair, discriminatory.
Okay, so Hamilton's plans are clearly creating fault lines. The sources mention the founders really hated the idea of political parties, factions, but they popped up anyway. How did that actually happen?
It seems almost inevitable looking back. It grew directly out of these deep disagreements over policy, economics, and the fundamental nature of the Republic. The rivalry between Hamilton and Jefferson was really central to it all.
How were their visions just so different?
Hamilton, leading the Federalists, wanted a strong central government focused on commerce, manufacturing, finance. He kind of admired the British system, believed in a broad reading of the Constitution, and thought government should be led by an educated elite, tying the wealthy to its success. He leaned towards Britain in foreign policy.
And Jefferson, representing the Democratic Republicans.
He pictured an agrarian republic, independent farmers as the backbone, advocated for states' rights, limited federal power, strict interpretation of the Constitution.
Yeah.
He was deeply suspicious of cities, finance, anything that smelled like monarchy. He saw Hamilton's policies as benefiting a northern elite at the expense of farmers and the South, and he strongly favored revolutionary France.
And they were both in Washington's first cabinet. That must have been awkward.
Awkward is an understatement. It was incredibly tense. Their clashes over the bank, the debt, foreign policy, it became public battles fought through allies and newspapers. Having such opposing figures right there in the cabinet probably accelerated the whole process of party formation.
So how did these factions go from cabinet arguments to actual political parties across the country?
Well, Hamilton started organizing his supporters, building a network, especially among commercial interests. That became the Federalist Party. Jefferson and Madison responded, organizing their own anti-administration group, the Republican or Democratic Republican Party. They pulled in former anti-Federalists, farmers, those wary of federal power.
And key events push people into one camp or the other.
Exactly. Things like the fight over Hamilton's plan, the response to the French Revolution, and maybe especially the huge controversy over Jay's treaty with Britain. Those events really solidified these groups into national parties with distinct platforms and groups of supporters.
How did these early parties get their message out and organize?
Two things were really crucial: a very partisan press and the use of government jobs or patronage. Newspapers back then weren't trying to be neutral. They were explicitly party tools. John Fenno's Gazette of the United States was the main Federalist paper, backed by Hamilton. Philip Frenno's National Gazette was the top Democratic Republican voice, supported by Jefferson. He even gave Frenno a government job.
Wow.
And his papers went at each other, hammer and tongs. Bitter attacks, shaping public opinion, mobilizing voters. They even printed pre-filled ballots sometimes.
And patronage, using government jobs for politics.
Yep. The president appointed lots of officials, postmasters, customs collectors, etc. These jobs became tied to politics pretty quickly. Officials were often expected to kick back a percentage of their salary to the party. It wasn't the full-blown spoils system yet, but it definitely linked federal jobs to party loyalty and helped fund campaigns.
It sounds like politics got pretty intense and organized really fast.
Absolutely. The ideal of disinterested gentlemen serving the public good quickly gave way to fierce, organized partisan competition.
So the government's setting up, parties are forming, but there were also major challenges at home, testing the new government's authority. You mentioned the Whiskey Rebellion earlier.
That's a classic example. A direct challenge to federal power, specifically that excise tax on whiskey. For those Western Pennsylvania farmers, it felt unfair, burdensome. They resented having to go to distant federal courts if they didn't pay.
What actually happened? How bad did it get?
Well, resistance grew from petitions to violence against tax collectors, tarring and feathering, attacks. By 1794, it was a full-blown rebellion. Armed men gathered, threatened Pittsburgh after a clash at a tax collector's house.
How did the federal government respond to armed uprising?
Washington and Hamilton saw it as a fundamental test. Could the government enforce its own laws? After talks failed, Washington used the Militia Act, called up about 13,000 troops.
13,000, that's a huge force.
Massive. Washington himself even rode out with them initially, showing how serious it was. Hamilton later took command in the field.
What was the outcome? Was there a big battle?
No major battle. The sheer size of the federal force basically caused the rebellion to collapse. Most rebels just went home. Only a couple were convicted, and Washington later pardoned them. But the point was made.
The government showed it could use force.
And would use force to enforce its laws. A crucial precedent.
But it must have deepened the political divisions, too.
Absolutely. Many people, especially Democratic Republicans, were horrified. They saw it as government overreach, using military force against citizens. Too much like the British they'd just fought. It definitely rallied support for the Republicans, particularly out west. The tax stayed unpopular and was eventually repealed under Jefferson. It really highlighted those class and regional tensions.
Beyond taxes, westward expansion was a constant issue, bringing the U.S. into conflict with Native American nations. How did the government handle this complex situation?
Federal policy was, well, complicated and often contradictory. It involved making treaties, attempts at assimilation or civilization, and military force. But the underlying goal was usually about acquiring land for settlers.
So treaties were made, but...
Secretary of War Henry Knox initially favored negotiating treaties, treating tribes as sovereign nations to cede land, rather than just conquering them. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790 tried to make the federal government the sole authority for buying land to prevent fraud.
But the treaties often didn't stick.
They often failed because the federal government couldn't or wouldn't stop American settlers from moving onto lands supposedly protected by treaty. In the Northwest Territory, a confederation of tribes fought back hard.
Like St. Clair's defeat.
Exactly. A devastating loss for the U.S. Army in 1791. That disaster led Congress to create a larger, more professional U.S. Army.
And that led to the Battle of Fallen Timbers.
Yes. General Mad Anthony Wayne led this new army and won a decisive victory against the Native Confederacy in 1794. That defeat forced them to negotiate the Treaty of Greenville in 1795.
What did that treaty do?
The tribes ceded huge territories in Ohio and Indiana in exchange for goods and annuities, yearly payments. These annuities, though, made them increasingly dependent on the U.S. government.
What about in the Southeast, with nations like the Creek and Cherokee?
Similar story, really. Treaties were signed, like the Treaty of New York with the Creeks or Holston with the Cherokee. Land was ceded, annuities paid. But these are also constantly undermined by settlers pushing onto their lands.
So, despite the language of treaties and sovereignty, the pressure for land usually won out.
The sources suggest the relentless demand for land by settlers, combined with the government's lack of will or maybe capacity to stop them, was the main driver. Washington himself complained that scarcely anything short of a Chinese wall could stop the settlers, and these Indian wars were expensive, eating up a big chunk of the federal budget.
We can't talk about this era without confronting the fundamental issue of slavery. How did the new federal government deal with it?
Well, slavery was deeply embedded and protected by the Constitution itself, even if the word slave wasn't used.
The Three-Fifths Compromise.
Right, boosting Southern political power. Congress couldn't ban the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years. There was a fugitive slave clause, power to suppress insurrections. These were compromises made to get Southern states to join the Union.
Was the Southern economy totally reliant on slavery?
Largely, yes. For cash crops like tobacco, rice, and increasingly cotton after the cotton gin, enslaved people were also huge capital investments. But it wasn't just a Southern issue economically.
How so?
The Northern economy was tied into it. Merchants shipping goods, bankers financing plantations, even Northern participation in the slave trade itself. Northern industries needed that Southern cotton. Locating the capital in the South also symbolized how embedded it was nationally.
What specific federal actions reinforced slavery in the 1790s?
The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 is a key one. Signed by Washington, it created a federal process for capturing and returning escaped slaves. Crucially, it denied accused fugitives basic legal rights, like jury trials, and forced Northern states to cooperate. It really laid the groundwork for future conflict.
Were there attempts to challenge slavery?
Early abolitionist petitions came to Congress in 1790. They sparked debate, but Congress basically said it couldn't touch slavery within the states. It could only regulate the international trade, which led to a limited ban in 1794 on U.S. ships trading slaves to foreign countries.
And as the country expanded west, slavery went with it.
Yes. Kentucky and Tennessee came in as slave states, keeping the balance in the Senate. The Southwest Ordinance explicitly allowed slavery in the territories south of the Ohio River, unlike the Northwest Ordinance.
Oh.
So federal policy actively allowed slavery's expansion.
It sounds like the failure to really address the contradiction between liberty and slavery early on just kicked the can down a very dangerous road.
Precisely. It baked those tensions and inequalities right into the foundation, leading to decades of crisis.
As if all these domestic issues weren't enough, foreign affairs were also a huge challenge and source of division. The French Revolution seems to have really thrown a wrench in the works.
It absolutely did. Initially, lots of Americans were enthusiastic, saw it as mirroring their own revolution. But as it got more radical, more violent, opinions split dramatically, right along party lines.
How did it divide Federalists and Republicans?
Federalists got alarmed by the Reign of Terror. They started sympathizing more with Britain, valuing stability and trade. Republicans, led by Jefferson, mostly stayed supportive of France, viewing them as a sister republic, and they felt bound by that 1778 alliance treaty.
So when France went to war with Britain in 1793, Washington had a tough call to make. Support France, support Britain, stay out.
Exactly. The U.S. was weak. It needed trade with both. Getting into a European war could have been fatal. Washington chose neutrality, issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793.
How did that go over?
It was meant to protect the U.S., but it outraged Jefferson and the Republicans. They saw it as a betrayal of France and, maybe more importantly, the president acting without Congress on a matter of war and peace. It sparked a big debate about executive power and foreign policy.
And then Citizen Genet showed up. What was that about?
Edmond Charles Genet, the new French minister. He arrived and, kind of fueled by Republican enthusiasm, immediately started commissioning American privateers to attack British ships, recruiting Americans, all before even officially presenting his credentials to Washington.
Wow, really pushing the boundaries of neutrality.
Totally violating it. It infuriated Washington and the administration. Genet even threatened to appeal directly to the American people over Washington's head.
That's a major diplomatic insult.
Huge. Even Jefferson eventually had to agree Genet had gone too far. Washington demanded his recall. The whole affair just showed how easily foreign events could inflame American politics and deepen the partisan divide.
But tensions with Britain continued, right? Seizing ships, impressing sailors.
Yes, that led to Jay's Treaty. To avoid war, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London in 1794. Hamilton was involved behind the scenes, stressing the need for peace and trade for his financial system.
What did the treaty actually get the U.S.?
Britain agreed to finally leave the forts in the Northwest and granted the U.S. most favored nation trade status. But it didn't stop impressment. Didn't get compensation for seized ships or for slaves taken during the Revolution, and offered only very limited trade access to the British West Indies.
So not exactly a great deal for America.
No. And when the terms leaked after the Senate secretly ratified it, there was a massive public backlash. Protests, burning effigies of Jay. People felt it was a humiliating sellout to Britain and a betrayal of France.
How did the parties react to the treaty fight?
Democratic Republicans jumped all over it. Proof, they said, of Federalist pro-British bias. Fatal to American liberty. Federalists defended it as the only way to avoid a disastrous war. Washington, despite his own doubts, signed it peace and trade first. The fight even continued in the House over funding it. That's when Washington first asserted executive privilege, refusing to hand over negotiation papers. The funding passed eventually, but the Jay Treaty fight. It dug the trenches between the parties incredibly deep, especially over foreign policy.
Under John Adams, things got even worse with France, leading to the XYZ affair.
Right. France, furious about Jay's treaty, started seizing American ships. Adams sent diplomats to Paris, but 3 French agents, called X, Y, and Z in the reports, demanded a huge bribe just to start talking.
A bribe to negotiate.
Yeah. When this news hit the U.S., it caused massive anti-French outrage. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, became the rallying cry.
And this led to an actual, though undeclared, war.
Yes, the Quasi-War, mostly fought at sea between 98 and 1800. And riding this wave of anti-French feeling and war fever, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798.
These laws were hugely controversial. What did they do?
4 laws. 1 made it harder to become a citizen. 2 Alien Acts gave the president power to deport foreigners deemed dangerous. But the real firestorm was over the Sedition Act.
What did the Sedition Act do?
It made it a crime to criticize the government, Congress, or the president with false, scandalous, and malicious intent, basically criminalizing political opposition.
How is it actually used?
Almost entirely against Democratic Republican newspaper editors and writers who criticized Adams and the Federalists. It was pretty clearly aimed at silencing the opposition press.
And the Republican response.
Furious backlash. Jefferson and Madison secretly drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions argued the Constitution was a compact between sovereign states. The federal government only had powers the states gave it. If it exceeded those powers, its acts were void.
And Kentucky's went further, introducing nullification.
Yes. Jefferson's draft argued states had the right to judge federal laws and that nullification was the proper response to unconstitutional acts. While other states didn't jump on the nullification bandwagon, these resolutions were huge. They rallied Republican opposition, laid out a powerful states' rights argument, and showed how a foreign policy fight could turn into a fundamental crisis over the Constitution and civil liberties.
So the nation is just incredibly divided by the time Washington decides to step down after 2 terms. His farewell address is seen as this really important moment. What were his main warnings?
Washington's address in '96 really reflected the turmoil he'd just lived through. His biggest warning was against the baneful effects of the spirit of party, especially parties based on region. He saw them as distracting, weakening governments stirring up trouble and opening the door to foreign meddling. He worried intense partisanship could even lead to tyranny.
He also warned about foreign policy, didn't he?
Famously, yes.
Also.
He advised the U.S. to steer clear of permanent alliances. Stick to commercial ties, he said, but avoid deep political connections. That came straight from his struggles to stay neutral between France and Britain, which had caused so much domestic strife. Don't have habitual hatred or an habitual fondness for other nations, he warned, or you become their slave.
His departure meant the first contested presidential election in 1796. How did that transition actually go?
Well, it pitted John Adams, the Federalist VP, against Thomas Jefferson, the leading Republican. Adams won, but barely. And under the rules back then, the runner-up, Jefferson, became vice president.
So president and vice president from opposing parties.
Exactly. A recipe for tension right there in the executive branch. But despite all the partisan anger during the campaign, the actual handover of power from Washington to Adams was peaceful. That itself was a major achievement. Still, the Adams administration faced immediate legitimacy challenges, the French crisis, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the states pushing back with the resolutions. It all showed the government's authority was still very much being fought over.
It really seems like Washington's personal stature had been holding things together in some ways.
I think that's a key point. People wondered if the Republic could survive without him. The whole idea of a legitimate political opposition was still really new and contested. Federalists often saw any Republican criticism as practically treason. The decade ended with the nation feeling, well, still pretty shaky.
When we look back at this period today, how should we think about the story? Are there ways the traditional narrative might oversimplify things?
Well, textbooks sometimes focus so much on the Founding Fathers as almost mythical figures. It can obscure a tougher look at the policies themselves and who they actually helped or hurt. The 1790s weren't just about great men smoothly implementing a plan. They were about really contentious choices with unequal outcomes. And the rise of parties. It's often framed as this problem the founders didn't want, which is true, they disliked factions. But given the depth of the disagreements, not just abstract philosophy, but who gets power, who benefits economically, how regions relate, maybe organized opposition was almost bound to happen, the Constitution's own compromises left room for these fights.
And critically, who actually held power during this time and whose voices maybe weren't being heard?
That's crucial. Power was overwhelmingly held by propertied white men. Federalist policies clearly aimed to benefit commercial elites, mostly in the North. Republicans championed the common man and farmers, but their leaders often included wealthy Southern planters whose power depended entirely on slavery, Native Americans. They were largely treated as obstacles to expansion, objects of policy, not really participants with power within the U.S. system. Enslaved people had zero political power. They were property. Federal laws like the Fugitive Slave Act actively reinforced the power of slaveholders, an institution with economic ties both North and South. Women were completely excluded from formal politics. Even many non-propertied white men couldn't vote yet, though the Republicans started mobilizing them.
So the decisions of the 1790s didn't just launch a government. They solidified power structures that benefited certain groups while marginalizing or oppressing others.
Exactly. That unequal distribution of power was baked in early and was a root cause of so many of the conflicts we talked about.
This deep dive into 1789 to 1800 really shows this paradox, doesn't it? It was a time of essential building courts, finance, rights, but also intense conflict and fragmentation. Those debates over federal power, the economy, liberty, foreign policy, they weren't settled. They got embedded right into the American experience.
And the policies, the power struggles of this decade, they didn't just vanish in 1800. They absolutely laid the groundwork for so many enduring conflicts, states' rights, slavery, constitutional interpretation, shaping the country for centuries.
Thinking about all these intense debates and divisions we've covered today, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? In what ways are we still navigating these same fundamental questions about power, liberty, and who we the people truly includes? Questions that were first tested so fiercely in those initial 11 years.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.